The Black Death hit Europe hard. It was a terrible disease, a plague, that swept across the continent in the mid-1300s. No one had ever seen anything like it. It killed millions of people, changing everything about medieval society. The world people knew before the plague was gone, replaced by something new and very different. This change happened in many ways, affecting how people lived, worked, thought, and even how they saw God. The plague started far away, probably in Central Asia. It moved along trade routes carried by fleas on rats. These rats traveled on ships and carts, bringing the sickness with them. It reached Europe in the late 1340s. Sicily was one of the first places hit. From there, it spread quickly. It moved through Italy, then France, Spain, England, and across Germany and Scandinavia. No country was safe. People did not know how the disease spread. They saw people get sick very fast. High fever, chills, pain, then black swellings called buboes would appear in armpits and groins. Death usually followed within days. It was horrifying. Families watched their loved ones die. Neighbors saw whole households vanish. The plague moved faster than anyone could react. Towns and villages were devastated. Some places lost half their population, others lost even more. Estimates vary, but many historians believe between 30% and 50% of Europe's population died. That is tens of millions of people. Think of it, almost one in every two people dying. It was a scale of death that is hard to imagine. Fear was everywhere. People felt helpless. Our doctors had no cures. They tried strange remedies, but nothing worked. Many believed it was a punishment from God. Some people locked themselves away. Others fled to the countryside, but often carried the plague with them. Funerals stopped happening. There were too many dead to bury properly. Mass graves became common. The immediate impact was sheer chaos and despair. Life lost its value in many ways. But even in this horror, seeds of change were planted. The massive loss of life meant there were simply fewer people left. This fact, more than anything else, started a chain reaction of changes across society. The old ways of doing things began to crumble because the people who made them work were gone. The biggest and most immediate change was economic. Before the Black Death, Europe had a huge population. This meant there were lots of people looking for work. Landowners and lords had plenty of laborers. Wages were low. Serfs who were tied to the land had little power. They had to work their lord's land and pay him taxes. They couldn't leave without permission. After the plague, everything was different. So many people died that there were not enough workers. Fields lay empty. Workshops stood idle. There was a severe labor shortage. This was a huge problem for the landlords. They needed people to farm their land. They needed people to build their castles. They needed people to do all the tasks that kept the economy going. This shortage gave the surviving workers, especially the peasants and serfs, a lot more power. Now, if a lord treated his serfs badly, they could simply leave. They could go to another lord who offered better terms. Or they could move to a town, where there was also a great demand for skilled workers. The competition for labor meant wages went up, sometimes dramatically. For the first time, ordinary laborers could demand more money for their work. They could ask for better conditions. They could even ask for their freedom from serfdom. The lords had to agree to these demands, or their lands would go unworked. This was a huge shift in power. Before, the lord had all the power. Now, the worker had some leverage. Governments tried to stop this. In England, the king passed laws like the Statute of Laborers. This law tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels. It made it illegal for peasants to ask for more money. It also tried to keep serfs on their land. But these laws mostly failed. The basic economic forces of supply and demand were too strong. There simply weren't enough people. Landlords also changed what they produced. Growing grain was very labor-intensive. With fewer workers, many lords switched to raising sheep. Sheep farming needed fewer people. This also meant less demand for grain and more for wool. Towns grew as people left the countryside for better chances. The old feudal economy, based on large numbers of serfs working the land, was cracking. A new, more market-driven economy was slowly starting to appear. The economic changes quickly led to social changes. The traditional feudal system, which had defined society for centuries, began to break down. This system had a rigid structure. At the top were the king and nobles, below them were knights, then merchants and craftsmen in towns, and at the bottom, the vast majority of people were peasants and serfs. Everyone had a fixed place. The plague disrupted this order. Serfs who were once tied to their lord's land now saw opportunities. They knew they were valuable. They started to demand their freedom. They wanted to be able to move where they pleased and work for whoever offered the best pay. Many lords, desperate for labor, granted these freedoms. They gave peasants charters, freeing them from their obligation. This new sense of value and freedom made peasants bolder. But many nobles and landlords were resistant. They tried to keep the old system going. They used laws to cap wages and force peasants back onto their land. They also tried to raise taxes to make up for their own losses. This created a lot of tension and anger among the common people. This anger exploded in various peasant rebellions across Europe. The most famous was the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. As peasants and common folk marched on London, they demanded an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and greater freedom. They burned manors and killed officials. They even confronted the young King Richard II. The revolt was eventually put down with great violence. Its leaders were executed. But it showed how much things had changed. Peasants were no longer just passive workers. They were aware of their rights and their power. They were willing to fight for a better life. Similar revolts happened in France, the Jacquerie, and other parts of Europe. These rebellions, even when crushed, had a lasting impact. They showed that the old ways could not last. Over time, serfdom slowly faded away in Western Europe. More peasants became free tenants, paying rent for land instead of being bound to it. Social mobility, though still limited, increased. Some noble families died out from the plague, and new families rose to power. The rigid social hierarchy was becoming a little more fluid. The plague had shaken the very foundations of medieval society, making people question their place in the world and their ruler's authority. The Black Death also profoundly impacted people's beliefs, their art, and how they learned. The church, which was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, faced a huge challenge. Priests, monks, and nuns died in large numbers, often because they cared for the sick. Many villages lost their entire clergy. This meant less educated and less experienced people took over religious roles. For many, the plague caused a crisis of faith. How could a loving God allow such a terrible thing to happen? Why did prayers not stop the disease? Some people turned away from God. Others became even more devout, believing the plague was divine punishment for sins. They sought extreme ways to show their piety. Groups like the flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves to atone for sins, hoping to appease God. The church's inability to explain or stop the plague weakened its authority. People started to question its power and teachings. Yet, paradoxically, many people also gave more money and land to the church in their wills. They wanted to ensure their souls went to heaven. This led to the church becoming very wealthy, even as its spiritual standing was challenged. The widespread suffering also led to a rise in persecution, especially against Jewish communities, who were often blamed for the plague. Culturally, the plague left a deep mark on art and literature. Before the plague, art often depicted saints and glorious religious scenes. After, themes of death, decay, and the fragility of life became common. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif. It showed skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, popes in a dance to the grave. This reminded everyone that death spared no one. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a pervasive idea. Literature also changed. Writers began to focus more on human experiences and less on purely religious tales. People like Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron during the plague in Italy, told stories about groups of people fleeing the plague. Geoffrey Chaucer in England wrote the Canterbury Tales. These works were often written in the vernacular language, the common language of the people like English or Italian, not just Latin. This made literature more accessible to ordinary people and helped to shape national languages. Education also saw changes. Many scholars and teachers died, universities were often disrupted, but in the long run, new colleges and universities were founded. There was a need for educated people to run the government and the church. The focus shifted a little. There was less emphasis on old ways of learning and more on practical skills and understanding the world. The plague forced people to reconsider their relationship with God, their purpose in life, and how they expressed these thoughts. The Black Death was not a one-time event. It became endemic, meaning it recurred in waves for centuries after its initial devastating arrival. But the first outbreak was the most impactful. It set in motion changes that shaped the future of Europe. It did not end the Middle Ages overnight, but it greatly sped up the decline of the old medieval system. One of the most significant long-term consequences was the final nail in the coffin for serfdom in Western Europe. The bargaining power of laborers continued to grow. Peasants gained more freedom and rights. This paved the way for a more individualistic society where a person's worth was increasingly based on their skills and labor, not just their birth. Economically, the plague helped shift Europe towards a more market-driven economy. With fewer people, labor became a valuable commodity. This encouraged innovation and efficiency. The trade networks adapted. Towns continued to grow as centers of commerce and opportunity. The increased wealth for some, thanks to inheritances or higher wages, also created new demand for goods and services. The intellectual and cultural shifts also continued. The questioning of traditional authority, both secular and religious, helped create an environment where new ideas could flourish. The focus on human experience in art and literature and the use of vernacular languages laid some groundwork for the Renaissance. The Renaissance, which started in Italy not long after the plague, emphasized humanism, art, and a rediscovery of classical knowledge. The plague, in its grim way, forced people to look at the world differently and re-evaluate their values. The value of human life itself arguably increased. With fewer people, each individual person was more important. This might have contributed to a greater respect for individuals and their freedoms over time. While the plague brought immense suffering, it also inadvertently broke down rigid social structures and allowed for greater social and economic mobility. The Black Death marks a clear dividing line in history. It ended the High Middle Ages and ushered in the Late Middle Ages, which was a period of great change and transition. It pushed Europe away from its feudal past and set it on a path toward early modern society. The changes were slow and often brutal, but they were profound. The plague was a catastrophe, but it also reshaped society in ways that ultimately led to new possibilities and a different future.